In this video, we conclude our discussion on Chapter 5, where in our last video we examined how we could compare total output over time. In today's video, we'll examine a data source to examine GDP by considering some preliminaries to then consider our data source, and then go over how the US uses its output, and then conclude with the income approach. Beginning with our preliminaries, now that we can measure total output for an economy, measure average income for an economy, as well as compare total output in an economy over time, we would like to examine this information in the real world using the United States as an example. But before we do so, let us recall our breakdown of goods and services for an economy, where we have all goods and services for a particular economy. This could be broken up into private sector and public sector goods and services, where the public sector comprised how the government spends their money on goods and services, and the private sector could be broken up into consumption and investment goods and services, where consumption goods and services were how consumers spent their money on goods and services, and investment goods and services were how firms spent their money on goods and services. Now, this decomposition was sufficient to introduce and visualize all the goods and services available for an economy in terms of categorizing the goods and services by sector, as well as by agent type and industry type. But this initial decomposition was for a closed economy, that is, an economy that does not participate in international trade. Most economies today in the world are open economies. Therefore, we should expand our decomposition to reflect this, where an open economy is one that participates in international trade. So let us revisit our visualization. We have all goods and services for a particular economy. We have the private sector and the public sector as before. Public sector is for the government spending money on goods and services. Private sector can be broken up into consumption and investment goods and services. Consumption is how consumers are spending their money on goods and services, and investment is how firms are spending their money on goods and services. But now we're also introducing net exports, where this considers imports and exports. So all we did in our decomposition was introduce net exports in the private sector goods and services categorization. This consists of foreign agents participating in domestic markets through imports and exports, where exports are going to be domestic economies selling their goods and services to foreign economies, whereas imports are going to be domestic economies purchasing goods and services from foreign economies. So then based upon this decomposition, we now also have a way to look at total output via how our agent types spend money in the aggregate product market. And this will yield us the expenditure approach to calculating GDP, which we can see with the formula below. Y is equal to C plus I plus G plus NX, where Y is going to be GDP in terms of expenditures on goods and services. C is going to be consumption expenditures by consumers. I is going to be investment expenditures by firms. G is going to be government expenditures by the government. And NX, that is net exports, the difference between exports and imports, is going to be net exports by our foreign agents. And this is how we're going to view output uses in the United States, where to find this information, we can make use of the following database, the St. Louis Federal Reserve Bank, where a link to this database is provided below. And this is a branch of the United States Federal Reserve banking system that houses U.S. data on financial, population, output, price, and other related variables. So to begin, let us start with GDP. We have some GDP figures for the United States for Q4, that is quarter 4 of 2021. And this is going to consist of the sum of expenditures on consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. Where here we have our measures in terms of real GDP and real GDP per capita, or once again, quarter 4 of 2021. And our base here is 2012. So we are controlling for prices in terms of how this was constructed, and the prices that we're using are for 2012. Our value for real GDP, so all goods and services, is $19,805.962 billion. And in terms of real GDP per capita, it is 59,692. So what this means is, after controlling for prices, if we took a random person off the streets of the economy of the United States, we would on average expect them to have an income process of $59,692. Additionally, something to keep in mind in regards to GDP, particularly with that of real GDP, is that for the United States, real GDP grows on average about 3% each year, and this is a figure that we will revisit in future chapters. Now, proceeding on to our first component of GDP, we have consumption, which is going to be consumer expenditures on goods and services, where on average this will account for 2/3 of GDP in the United States. We're looking at our figures. Real consumption for Q4 2021, where 2012 is going to be our base year once again, had a value of $13,842.662 billion. And in terms of percentages of real GDP, it comprised about 69.89% of real GDP, which is in line with our 2/3 estimate. Moving on to investment, this is going to be how firms are spending their money on goods and services on things such as plants, machinery, equipment, and business inventories, where on average for the United States, this will comprise about 1/6 of GDP and is a pretty volatile component of GDP. And in terms of our figures for Q4 2021, where once again 2012 is our base year, it had a value of $3,868.934 billion and was about 19.53% of real GDP for 2021, which is in line with our estimate of 1/6 of GDP. Next, we have government expenditures, which are going to be resources purchased by the public sector, which is going to be on things such as education, so K through 12 schooling, infrastructure spending on things such as highways, as well as defense spending in terms of the military, where on average this will account for 1/5 of GDP in the United States, where in terms of our figures, for Q4 2021, where 2012 is our base year once again, government expenditures had a value of $3,356.829 billion and comprised about 16.94% of real GDP, which is in line with our 1/5 figure. Then lastly, we have net exports. This is the difference between exports and imports, where on average the United States runs a negative trade balance. That is, its imports exceeds its exports. So the United States is purchasing more foreign goods and services than it is selling domestic goods and services to foreign economies. Where in terms of our figure, for Q4 2021, where 2012 is our base year, net exports was negative $1,337.978 billion. So we see that we have that negative value. So that means, once again, that imports is greater than exports. The United States is purchasing from foreign economies more than it's selling to foreign economies. So then, with this information, in our decomposition of total output, we measured GDP by examining how agents are spending in the aggregate product market. This was referred to as the expenditure approach. An alternative way that we could approach this, though, as well, is to examine income generated in the aggregate factor markets. This is referred to as the income approach. And this is going to be based upon agents spending money on goods and services will generate income for other agents on the other side of this transaction. So from this perspective, we have that expenditures must equal income, so the expenditure and income approach must equal one another. To get a visualization of this, here we have our product and we have our factor markets, where in terms of our transactions, we have our agent types of consumers, firms, governments, and foreign agents spending money in the product market. And when they do, though, this translates to income being generated in the factor markets in terms of paying out money to labor on wages, paying out capital in the form of rent and interest, as well as paying out profits to our shareholders. So here we have two different approaches to calculating GDP that equal the same thing. Money earned is equal to money spent.